Welcome to the AIER Standard, a production of the American Institute for Economic Research. It should be no shock to anyone that the issue of race is still alive in today's American politics. The use of racial classification for the purposes of justice, equity, and research is becoming more, not less important after the Civil Rights Movement, which sought to end the government's use of race for nefarious ends. However, the failings and controversies of the modern American legal regime and its relationship to race continue to spark debate and reevaluation today. Joining us today is an expert on this exact topic, Professor David Bernstein, who's an accomplished legal scholar who has published on the topic of race and the law, and is the author of the forthcoming book, Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. Bernstein is a university professor and executive director at the Law and Liberty Center at Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, the exact school that we're recording here today. And he's also been teaching for over 20 years. He's also taught at other esteemed institutions such as Brooklyn Law School, Georgetown University Law Center, the University of Michigan Law School, and William & Mary Law School. After graduating from Yale Law, he clerked on the Sixth Circuit for the Honorable David A. Nelson. Professor Bernstein, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I wanted to first touch on the book that is forthcoming, Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. So just super briefly, what is that untold story?
So most of us are familiar with the fact that before the modern civil rights era, we had a racial classification scheme in the United States, in particular in the South, where different states had different rules regarding how we decided who was black and who was white. You could be 1/4 black, could be black, or 1/8, or some states had the 1-drop rule. And we also had rules about who was Asian, and therefore, under the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924, weren't allowed to become citizens of the United States or to immigrate to the United States. And most of us think that this era of racial classification ended in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, and that nowadays, while we all check off these forms on college applications and so forth, that there's no official racial classification scheme in the United States that's all actually self-identified. But in fact, all those boxes we check when we're filling out different kinds of applications or forms, employment forms, mortgages, green card applications, whatever they may be, actually come out of official government classifications that the federal government implemented in 1978, and they have real definitions that we're supposed to abide by. We're not always informed very well because exactly what they are, but they do sometimes have real life consequences. So if you want, for example, to get minority preferences as a government contractor, and you check off you're Hispanic or you're black or whatever it may be, and someone in the government who's reading your form has some reason to doubt that you're a member of that group, they will actually ask you to provide evidence and have a hearing as to whether you are really a member of that group. And then if you don't meet the definition, you won't get the contract, you won't get the minority status anyway. And in some cases where people have claimed to be a certain ethnic group for employment purposes, when there's an affirmative action program involved, and it turned out they weren't, they've actually been fired by the government for that.
So we had the civil rights movement to essentially push back against the government using race as a form of discrimination to keep some groups down. And yet today, after we passed a bunch of laws that were mainly intended for good purposes, to provide justice for various minority groups, these same classifications are now being used in a way that's also detrimental to various ends when it comes to justice.
Right. I mean, the official classifications came about for pretty innocuous reasons. So there was a lot of sentiment in the 1950s that after Jim Crow, after the Holocaust, that the best they could do would be abolish these classifications entirely, which they actually did for a time in Canada for the same reasons. But then once the civil rights laws were enacted, it turned out that some of the laws either sort of required statistics to, like, for example, how you're going to enforce the Voting Rights Act if you don't know how many black people there are in a particular district and whether they're being excluded somehow from voting, and even like employment laws and other laws, because the courts were willing to accept statistical evidence of discrimination, there had to be some way to know what those statistics are. Plus, after the Great Society, there was an impetus within the government. We want to make sure that different groups are making social and economic progress, and how do we do that unless we can measure them? So the government started collecting all these different statistics, sometimes directly, sometimes through employers or through universities. But each agency had its own definitions. So, for example, for what we now call the Hispanic or Latino category, some agencies use Spanish surname. Some use from a Spanish-speaking household. Some separated out Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and did not include Cubans. Some did include Cubans as a separate category, and so forth and so on. The same was true for other classifications as well. So in the early 1970s, the government decided we need to regularize these statistics because otherwise we're comparing apples and oranges. And forget if one agency is sending us statistics about education using one definition of, say, Asian American or Oriental, whatever they would have called it at that time, and someone else is using another statistic, we can't really compare those. So they created a committee to try to work out these definitions and classifications. It wasn't secret, but it was sort of under the radar. No one thought it was an especially controversial or important thing. And when they implemented the rules, ultimately, they specify these are only meant for these statistical purposes. They're not sociological categories, anthropological categories, certainly not scientific categories. They shouldn't be used, for example, to determine eligibility for government programs. But not surprisingly, with the way bureaucracies work, people needed something to use for, say, affirmative action programs, and this is what was available, so they just, in fact, did use them immediately for that purpose. So sort of one of the ironies, for example, now, is when we have litigation over affirmative action in higher education, which is coming to the Supreme Court, and, say, Harvard University argues, well, we have to use these classifications to have educational diversity. There was never any inkling by anyone in the government when they created these statistics that the purpose of these statistics and classifications would be to determine who gets affirmative action for diversity purposes and who doesn't in college admissions. It wasn't even something that was on their radar screen.
So when it comes to, first and foremost, the idea of who's in a certain race and who's not in a certain race was very nebulous to begin with. And then when we start using race as a means of divvying out certain resources, certain benefits, you're only strengthening the sort of uncertainties that come with trying to make these decisions based off race. When we actually need to codify what's a black person, what's an Asian person, even though most people probably didn't even agree about what's black, what's Asian, what's Latino, what have you in the first place.
Well, we have to remember that historically speaking, back when this became a big issue in the early 70s. The United States was almost entirely a country defined by a white majority and a significant, 10 to 15% in that range, a black minority. And because of the history of the one-drop rule and so forth, anyone with discernible black ancestry who, quote-unquote, looked black or who looked white but identified as black because of their black ancestry was deemed to be black. So it wasn't really that, there were, of course, always borderline cases, but for the most part, everyone knew who was white and who was black. Less than 1% of the population of the United States was what we now call Asian American. Less than 1% was Native American, and Hispanics, what we now call Hispanics, were classified generically as white. So at the time, no one really thought this was going to be much of a controversial issue and also it should be added that the rate of black-white intermarriage was extremely low back in the early 70s. So it wasn't like we're going to get a lot of hard cases because of that. Right. I think it was 2% or something for black people marrying someone who was white, and even lower for whites marrying someone who's black. So we had this sort of black-white binary, and no one really thought very hard about what would this mean if all of a sudden tens of millions of immigrants came from Latin America and East Asia and South Asia and so forth. So it was done in a really haphazard and somewhat arbitrary way. Just to give you an example, how did the Hispanic category come to be? Well, they didn't know again what to do with this classification. Should it be Spanish surname? What about a woman who is Hispanic but's married to someone named Smith? So that's no good. Spanish language household. What if someone doesn't speak Spanish but they quote unquote look Hispanic and have a Hispanic name and may suffer discrimination? So basically, what they did literally is they asked for volunteers from different agencies to work on this, and they found one woman who was Cuban American, one woman who was Puerto Rican, and one who was Mexican American to represent the three major Latino constituencies in the U.S. They sort of sat them together in a room and they hashed it out without really any public comment or input or controversy. And the woman from Puerto Rico in particular was insistent that Hispanic was the right term. Hispanic was very controversial. It wasn't used in Latin America. It's still not used in Latin America. It wasn't used by Americans of Latin American origin. A lot of Chicano activists who felt they represented the mixed race and indigenous populations of Latin America. I always hated the term Hispanic because they saw Hispanics as Spanish, as the oppressors. But nevertheless, this woman said we kept coming back to Spain. That's the only commonality we could find among all these different national groups in Latin America. So she persuaded the other two to go along with Hispanic and to define the category as someone of Hispanic origin and culture. Why does that matter? Well, it matters, for example, because that means it includes people who are of direct Spanish descent, whose ancestors came to the United States directly from Spain, but it does not include Brazilians, who some people would think of as Latino, but it does not include them because they are not of Spanish descent or origin. So we have this weird irony now when it comes to affirmative action programs that a dark-skinned Brazilian is not eligible as a Hispanic, and it's not really clear what they're in, I guess, the other classification, the random other, but they're not Hispanic, and a completely European white person from Spain is considered a minority, just because of the arbitrary way the classification came about, with no real thought given. Again, they weren't even thinking about affirmative action as such, but that's what it was quickly used for.
And I want to, before we keep going on this topic, I want to back up a little bit just so our audience knows exactly what we're talking about. So you've laid out that these racial classifications are highly arbitrary and very messy, and clearly it's causing problems when it comes to using it to enforce laws, divvy out policy benefits, whatnot. So when did we go to the system that we have today? Because obviously pre-1964, the government was using racial classifications for things like Jim Crow, segregation, and then they passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which has things like Title VII that are supposed to provide discrimination barriers and protections to minorities. So what was the general purpose of using these classifications for, I guess, beneficial ends back in the 64 Civil Rights Act era?
So really, we have to go back a little bit further than that. The federal government in general didn't keep racial statistics except for the census, and that varied a little bit from decade to decade, but it was generally white, which included Mexicans, which was the largest Latin American group in the United States, and Hispanic, what we now call Hispanics more generally. There were classifications when we got more immigration from Asia for various Asian groups, and white also included people from the Middle East, and then there was a separate tally for Native Americans, mostly if they lived on reservations. Otherwise, they might just fall into the white category if they're of mixed race or so forth. But, very few federal government programs ever specifically related to race, right? Jim Crow is a state law institution or a local institution in the case of Washington, D.C., rather than a federal institution. But then starting when civil rights became a more prominent issue in American life, starting in the 40s and 50s, presidents issued sort of the first executive orders requiring government contractors to abide by federal civil rights laws, abide by federal civil rights policies. Anyway, we don't want to contract with employers who are discriminating in employment. And the only way to enforce that was to know whether the contractors are indeed refusing to hire people of different ethnic and racial origins. So a government agency called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance came up with forms for employers to fill out, asking them, to tell the government how many employees you have overall and how many are minorities. Negro, as the word would have been then, Negro, Oriental, as it would have said then, Jews, originally Spanish Americans, which is a euphemism mostly for Mexicans, and others. So others, who knows what that means. This created certain problems because the policy until the 1970s, which you don't ask employees what race or ethnicity they are because that could lead to trouble. We want to be neutral. So the employers were supposed to just sort of look at people's faces and last names and guess. I guess they could also just make stuff up if they want to. I'm not sure how you would enforce this, but that's what they were supposed to do. I guess they could be audited in some way. But in any event, Jews eventually, pretty quickly, actually dropped off the list. This was a combination of black-oriented civil rights organizations thinking that Jews didn't really need the same sort of assistance with discrimination, and Jewish organizations being uncomfortable with the government singling out Jews separate from the rest of the population. And you had to get this additional problem. How do you know if, for example, I don't know, someone with a name like John Black. Black could be your standard, English name. It could be someone whose name was Schwartz back in Germany and changed to Black, and that German could be Jewish, could be not Jewish. So it's a real problem. So basically, partly for reasons of happenstance, partly because of discomfort among Jews in particular with them being tabulated by anybody, and partly because it was a lot easier to just tabulate people who looked like a member of a minority group who were visibly minority. The categories that the government eventually came up with, they used different terminology back in the early 60s, but your basic classifications of Hispanic, Black, Asian, Native American were basically implemented then, and that became the baseline for when in '64, when they passed the '64 Act, they wanted to have statistics to make sure that a company in an area that's 30% Black or 30% Japanese, if they're not hiring a lot of people who are Japanese or Chinese, that at least calls maybe for some investigation. So they basically again started using these categories. The problem they faced, as I noted, was that to the extent they wanted to use the data across agencies, they were getting different reports with different definitions from different agencies. There was no standardized. The Office of Contract Compliance had its own rules, of course, but whether the Department of Commerce, Department of Housing and Urban Development, when that was created, the Defense Department, the Health, Education and Welfare, and then sub-agencies in the Health, Education and Welfare, there's no directive. How exactly do we count people? So it was, the formation of these an ossification of these classifications and was sort of done sort of haphazardly and innocently. They didn't mean to sort of create formal classifications that would affect people's identity, with one exception. The Hispanic Latino classification was really invented to a large extent by the government. There were Latino activists out there, but most Latino activists in the 60s and 70s were Mexican American. They were Chicano activists, and they didn't feel like they had much in common with Puerto Ricans and Cubans and other Latinos, particularly with Cubans, who were less likely to have indigenous ancestry. But the Nixon administration, when faced with how do we start defining this group of people who are Spanish speakers or their descendants, first of all, they said, well, President Nixon said, to himself, to his aides, there's a lot of radicalism. There's Chicano activists, there are Puerto Rican nationalists who are hijacking airplanes. It would be better to create a pan-national sort of American Hispanic identity that would hopefully reduce their ties to their homeland and their specific ethnicities. There was also the issue that Nixon said, well, we could have separate classifications for Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans because they tend to be dark-skinned, as a lot of agencies were doing. But then what about the Cubans? They vote for us. They vote for Republicans. Why should we leave them out of programs that are meant to help Hispanics? And then there was also pressure from Hispanic media executives, like the founders of Univision, who wanted a broad national audience. They didn't want as was the case at the time, Mexicans in California say, well, we're not going to watch a show from Puerto Rico, or we're not going to watch a show from Argentina. So they wanted to help create a Hispanic identity so they could market to that national thing. So weirdly, the Hispanic classification, which has become so routine we don't even really think about it, was a weird invention of a combination of, convenience for bureaucracy, Nixonian political machinations, and big business.
So what you're basically communicating is that this idea that we seem to talk so, I guess, confidently today in society when we're talking about race relations, like, oh, you're a white person, you're a black person, you're a, whatever, and then therefore you are this, this, and that, right? Or you deserve this, this, and that. Like these things that we talk so confidently about are actually far more nebulous and a lot messier than most people probably think.
Yeah, most of us, who attend elite universities and law schools, whatever, we're so used to these classifications that they come naturally to us. But interestingly enough, at the grassroots, it's not nearly as simple. Despite the government both implementing and encouraging these identities, and a lot of political actors encouraging them too, it's still the case that most people that we call Hispanic or Latino, if you ask them their preference, they'd rather either be called, hyphenated American, Mexican American, Guatemalan American, or just American. They accept Hispanic and Latino as an identity, but it's not their primary one. In the case of Asian Americans, if you go to Harvard or whatever, the idea that there is this category called Asian American is just kind of accepted, but less than half, something like 38% of actual Asian Americans accept it even as a secondary identity. It has not really caught on, especially among people who don't go to the kinds of places where the ideology requires them to do this. And even at places like Harvard, one of the oddities of the Asian category is that it includes people who are nothing alike in any way except that they're from the continent of Asia, specifically like people from India or Pakistan, South Asians and East Asians, like Chinese or Japanese. They are not ethnographically similar, they're not culturally similar, they don't have the same religions, same anything. And in fact, it was a close call whether South Asians were going to be considered white in the 70s or Asian. They're initially classified as white in the draft proposal, and then after some lobbying by some Indian American groups, they were switched to the Asian category. But in any event, even with that, we see at almost every campus that has a substantial number of Asian students is a separate Asian student organization, or sometimes Asian Pacific Islander, and a separate South Asian students organization. And the South Asian student organization is then often bifurcated between American South Asians, who sometimes feel a commonality because they're a minority, so Pakistanis and Indians and Sri Lankans and so forth will hang out together, but, graduate students from India and Pakistan tend to be very suspicious of each other because of the enmity between their nationalities. So you may actually have that third group. And then, Filipinos are ethnographically and otherwise also kind of dissimilar, and so on. And so, basically 60% of the world's population is captured within this Asian classification. So, it actually gives me some hope that despite all the centrifugal forces trying to tell people, erase your actual culture and ethnicity and history and just become this generic Asian American because that's convenient and suits our political purposes of trying to create, alliances and so forth, people are actually, more allowed to say, wait a second, I'm Chinese American. What do I have to do with someone from Bangladesh?
Yeah, and I want to dive into that affirmative action point more, and the point you bring up about especially Asian Americans. I'm sure people can tell by my last name what exactly I identify as, but it's certainly, I went to, and also the point about Northeast private schools certainly hits close to home for me as well. I went to undergrad in Connecticut at a private school as well, and so, there's the Asian American category, which came up mostly as a civil rights movement era. There's murder of a guy named Vincent Chin, and that sparked the whole Asian solidarity movement. Before that, the Japanese want to be Japanese Americans, the Chinese want to be Chinese Americans, and even when I was in college and involved in various Asian American advocacy groups, there was always these weird infighting between the East Asians and the South Asians. Like the Indians wanted more stuff focused on India, and the Chinese people wanted more stuff focused on China, and then whole Asian American Project Solidarity thing started getting a little rocky. And so I think, so what does that really mean for, especially with the Harvard case coming up on the next Supreme Court docket? Like, what is this? How do universities view the idea of race as it's applied to affirmative action? And I guess what are the realities that are created by it?
So that, you're going to be the first person to hear this. So I was just thinking of something interesting this morning, which is basically the universities are, who knows in individual cases whether they look at a more fine-tuned level, but for the most part, they operate at a crude level. How many Asian Americans do we have? How many Hispanics do we have? How many blacks? We have targets, goals. We don't call them quotas because that would be illegal, but we have in mind what we'd like to achieve, and then somehow it always works out to be almost exactly their goal. But they don't really differentiate within the different groups. Again, there may be a specific case we could say, well, they had 2 Asian students and one was Chinese and one was Hmong, and they didn't have any Hmongs they prefer. But in general, they're just looking at the crude statistics. And so first of all, this is, of course, it's racial discrimination because it's based on one's perception that Asians are sort of the same racial group. That's what's being challenged in the Harvard case. But there's also this weird dynamic. I mean, Asian groups vary dramatically in their socioeconomic success on average. So Indian Americans have the highest income of any ethnic group in the United States. There are other, mostly smaller Asian groups like the Hmong, like Bangladeshis, and a few others that actually have below average socioeconomic success. And there are some like Filipinos who used to be like the poorest ethnic group in the country who are now higher than average. But especially in higher education, very few schools break out the statistics for us, but it turns out Berkeley does. So I looked at Berkeley's website a while back. It's not in the book, but I would just say, because the book's not about affirmative action as such, but you learn a lot about these things on the side. So it turns out that the group that is most heavily overrepresented is actually people from India. They're like 10 times their population. I don't like the word overrepresented, but people use it. Overrepresented like 10 times their population. Chinese Americans, for example, are about 4 times. And I was thinking, why is it that Chinese Americans have been the leaders in most cases in the current movement against affirmative action preferences and against closing down the selective high schools, admissions tests, and so forth? And it occurred to me that there's 2 things going on. One thing is going on that you can look at the statistics for the Ivy League schools and see this pretty clearly, that they froze the percentage of Asians that were willing to take like 25, 30 years ago. So even though the Asian population has dramatically increased, they're still taking like 20%. So that means that there's more people applying and fewer spots. But it's worse than that if you are an ambitious Chinese parent, because it turns out, again, the schools don't differentiate between, say, people from India and people from China. And Indian Americans used to be a very small percentage of the population, but their percentage has grown really dramatically over the last 20, 30 years. So now it turns out someone like Berkeley, they're taking up a very large percentage of the slots that go to quote-unquote Asians. So if you're a Chinese American, again, ambitious parent, want your kids to go to Berkeley, you're faced with potentially, Berkeley's not allowed to use officially at least race in the admissions, but imagine this is a school somewhere else. You're faced with a situation where, say, Harvard has frozen the percentage of Asians. So that means that there are twice as many Chinese people in the United States. There's already half as many slots per capita. But then also, a lot of those slots now are going to Indians who weren't even who are a much larger percentage of the population than they used to be, and are even more overrepresented. So the percentage left for all the other groups is even that much smaller. So this is it's sort of it's a double whammy. So your kid's chances of getting in because of the informal Asian ceiling is much lower than it would have been 30 years ago. So it has the double whammy of the quota restricting the informal quota restricting the number of Asian students overall, and then you have another group within the Asian category that's very competitive and has gotten more people. So that is one issue. Then the other issue is, what about the groups that are actually underrepresented? So if you are a member of one of these groups that is like, let's say, a Hmong refugee, a child of a Hmong refugee or grandchild of a Hmong refugee in Minnesota, you're lumped in with just the general Asian category, even though the socioeconomics of your group may be more like, say, Puerto Ricans or somebody who are getting affirmative action. And it's even worse than that probably from you, because if you're the admissions director and you have the choice between the grandchild of a illiterate Hmong refugee who's from a working class family who doesn't have any connections or advantages, or you could say, and may struggle in school in part for social reasons because they're not used to that environment, or the child of an Indian or Chinese engineer in Silicon Valley who went to a fancy private school and could pay full tuition, you know who is likely to get the nod. So it's kind of it's just a generally weird thing, and it doesn't make any sense from a diversity point of view, because the way we operate is that by using these crude categories, so University of Texas, where there was litigation, for example, they might say, oh, we already have 20% Asians, but we only have 18% Hispanics, so we'll take another Mexican-American. Now we'll have our 2,000th Mexican-American. And then someone who's, say, Mongolian shows up and puts in the application, and he says, well, you don't have any Mongolians. I'd be your first Mongolian. And they say, well, you're not diverse because we already have 20% Asians. And the Mongolian American would rightly say, I'm not just some generic Asian American. Mongolia isn't, we don't call ourselves Asians. We're Mongolians. What? How dare you, right? How dare you say that, the great history of Mongolia going back to Genghis Khan and beyond is no different than the history of the Philippines or whatever and the culture. So it is a little ridiculous. So diversity-wise, it makes no sense. It doesn't make any sense to fine-tune the groups in a to not fine-tune the groups to use these very crude generalizations about different groups, even though there are different subgroups that have very different characteristics. And it leads, because there are several Asian American groups that do particularly well on educationally, it leads to these quotas that wind up being heavily discriminatory towards South Asians and all members of all Asian groups. But it's basically because those few groups take up I don't even want to use that phrase, but they win really so many of the slots that everyone else is discriminating against. And I should say that, interestingly enough, when Indian Americans, South Asians, were moved at the last minute from the white to the Asian category because of the lobbying of one particular Indian American group, another Indian American group found out about it. It was too late. The change had already been made. And they said, this is a mistake because we're going to lose in two ways eventually. First of all, white people are going to say, why should you get affirmative action in some contexts when Indian Americans are well off, and will be resented. And secondly, we're going to be limited to a certain number of slots that are allocated to Asians. And since we're doing really well, that will put more of a ceiling on us than if we were just put in the generic white group. And I think at least on the second point, they really turned out to be right about that.
So when it comes to assigning essentially benefits on the basis of these rigid race categories, you're saying that not only is it failing to address any of the inherent problems that they're aimed at addressing, but now you're just causing a lot of infighting within various ethnic groups. You're causing a lot of, essentially, it's almost like a public choice critique in the sense that when the government starts getting involved and there's a system and there's a structure at hand, then people are going to try to align themselves to benefit the most from that structure, whatever that structure might actually be. So now you've also caused, I remember I read one of your law review articles is talking about how Mexican Americans didn't want to be classified as non-white because that in itself came with its own detriments and its own types of issues I forgot what the time period you're talking about, but essentially when the rules of the game start to change and benefits start to flow one way or the other, then groups will start to essentially try to extract as much benefit as they can, try to minimize the detriments from it. And so basically you just kind of lay a playing field for a lot of infighting.
Yeah, I mean, the Mexican example is a good one because back in the 30s was considered disadvantageous to be non-white. Mexican American organizations lobbied for them to be considered white. In the 1950s, when anti-discrimination rules started to be passed, they sought to be considered a minority, but not necessarily a racial minority. And even as late as the 70s, they objected to being considered a racial minority. I think they thought the sweet spot, politically speaking, was to be white but a minority. So that's why Hispanic was made an ethnic category. And now they're lobbying to be made into a racial minority, which the Biden administration is considering. The Obama administration tried to do it, then the Trump administration killed it. Because I think now, the trend is, well, if you're associated all with whiteness, that's a bad thing, and you have to be a racial minority to get the full credit for minority status. But there are a lot of other examples. I mean, you said infighting. There's infighting in the African American community now because a lot of the affirmative action slots, so to speak, that were intended in some way to help people whose ancestors suffered from slavery and Jim Crow are actually going to immigrants and their children and grandchildren. There have been controversies at Harvard, at Cornell, and so forth. In the 1980s, the government said, should we really consider African immigrants to be the same category as native born African Americans who've been in the country for a long time? And they just sort of arbitrarily said, yeah, we'll just keep them in the same. And they could have said the opposite, and then we'd have a separate category, but they didn't. In the 1990s, there was a big movement to have a multiracial category recognized, and all the established civil rights organizations were against it because they were afraid that people who currently identify as, say, Black would identify, or Asian would identify as multiracial if they have one white parent. That would reduce the number of their constituents and thus their influence. It would make it harder to prove discrimination claims because you'd have a smaller baseline and so forth. And eventually that movement was sort of, the air was taken out of it when the government announced, well, we're not going to recognize a multiracial category, but now you could count more than one race. And basically, so we kind of won, that's good enough. But then what happened was, as soon as all these organizations kind of disbanded, the government sort of surreptitiously, via the bureaucracy, issued rules to different agencies and so forth that said, oh, by the way, if someone checks off Black and white, you count them as Black. If someone checks off Asian and Black, you count them as Black. If someone checks off Asian and white, you count them as Asian. So there's a hierarchy of who the most visible minorities, or whatever you want to call it, get the highest priority, but you don't get counted as both ultimately. So the multiracial movement in that sense actually lost eventually, but they had already sort of thought they had declared victory and went home. So, but yeah, the public choice thing is exactly right. That I think that the good news is that if you look at the demographic statistics, that Americans are assimilating well, and not just assimilating, like not assimilating into whiteness, whatever phrase like critics would use, but just like becoming Americans and and being willing to date, marry, have children with, and so forth, members of other groups. There's very high rates of interracial marriage among Asian Americans, very high rates among Hispanics. If you include the fact that, to a Chinese family, their kid marrying someone Korean would be considered like an interethnic marriage. The rates would be even higher. The rate of African American intermarriage has gone up. Interracial marriage has gone from 2% to 22% in the course of 4 decades. People then sort of reject the Asian American classification. They're not thrilled with the Hispanic one. They just want to be known as like other immigrant groups as hyphenated American or just American. But, the political forces are operating against it. So we have, I think, 2 visions of America here. One vision is that we have permanent racial groups and permanent racial enmity, and the only way to deal with it is by having the government classify people by these groups, figure out who's doing well, who's not, and then redistributing resources accordingly. And we have to do that because racism is built into America, and it's never going to change, and the only way to ensure fairness is by recognizing these racial differences, codifying them, and acting on that basis. The other vision is, while everyone's entitled to pride in their ethnic heritage and so forth, and no one's going to tell you that you shouldn't join the Korean American Club or the German American Club or the Mexican American Club or even the Latino Club or Asian Club or whatever identity you want to have, that officially the government should be more or less neutral with regard to race, except under very limited circumstances like enforcing the Voting Rights Act or whatever, and that we should all be rooting for an assimilation into a general American identity, that in 50 years or 100 years, there won't be African Americans and Latino Americans. They'll just be Americans with different racial heritages and ethnic heritages. And people think, a lot of people on the left, the critical race theory crowd and so forth, I think thinks this is ridiculous. This will again, they think it's immutable. Racism is immutable. It's built into the fabric of America. I'd say that, first of all, I think we've made tremendous progress just in the last 50 years with regard to race itself. But I also like to point out that there were other conflicts and differences among groups that were once considered immutable, and once considered that there's no way that people could just ignore these, and they are ignored, and we even find them ridiculous now. No one really cares that Joe Biden is Catholic, right? This was a huge issue in American life. The hostility to Catholics, it led to a huge growth in the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. It helped defeat a presidential candidate in 1928, and it could have led to John F. Kennedy's defeat. A lot of people would not vote for him because he was a Catholic in 1960. Now we have a Catholic president, Catholic Speaker of the House, majority Catholic justices on the Supreme Court, which occasionally people mention when it goes, maybe it has to do with their abortion rulings. But in general, no one really cares, right? This is amazing. No one could have anticipated this in 1960. If you told people in 1960 that without controversy, the government would be dominated essentially at the highest levels by Catholics, people would have said, no, the majority will never stand for it. I tell people, 60 years ago, before the civil rights movement's success, if I would have given a talk on this topic, most people would look at me, look at my last name, and say, "Oh, it's a Jew talking." Not necessarily even if they were hostile. That's just the way they would, they would perceive Jews as being different. But really, for the most part now, people, all these different ethnic groups, Poles, Italians, Germans, no one, again, they may have probably their ethnic heritage, it may belong to ethnic organizations, but we don't see them as being different in some immutable way, the way we used to. There are other, there used to be all sorts of hostility to Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and we've overcome those things. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that we can't overcome it with regard to race. And just like most people of European origin who once might have been considered Irish or Jewish or Jews or Poles and thus sort of unassimilable, just like we just think of them, they're just Americans, that eventually we'll all just think of ourselves as a multi-ethnic country who are just American.
So you talk about intermarriage, you talk about basically a sort of income mobility and social mobility that's possible in countries like America, and how that really complicates a picture when it comes to various racial and ethnic groups staying the way they are, right? It keeps changing, and that's why being a little bit more race neutral, race blind might be more advantageous, because you don't have to dive into that whole mess of various things going on there.
And then, for example, within the Black community, there's a new phrase that I just found out about while I was writing the book called ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, that we should be giving the benefits of affirmative action aimed at African Americans to descendants of slaves, not to immigrants. Among Hispanics, there's this, and among other groups that are commenting on Hispanics, like there's recognition, apparently belatedly because the Hispanic vote's been moving Republican, that, wait a second, a lot of Hispanics consider themselves to be white. About over 50% of Hispanics self-identify as white. They're a multi-ethnic group. They're not like a race as such. And why are we talking about Hispanics as if they're all people of color when some of them are of 100% European descent? So I think that they're reluctant to talk too much about this stuff because of affirmative action, because they know affirmative action is unpopular, under legal threat, and they're afraid if they pull the string, the whole thing unravels. But it's becoming increasingly recognized. I mean, conservatives have always been objected to these classifications on, principle grounds. The government shouldn't be classifying people. It's dangerous. It's immoral, and so forth. But even if you're in favor of classification, there is some recognition. Like, wait, these classifications are pretty crude, and they're pretty arbitrary. And why is it that again, a dark-skinned Brazilian who may actually face discrimination based on race is not a minority, but a person from Spain or Argentina of Italian descent is? So I mean, I think there's a willingness, at least in some circles, to revisit all this sort of thing, because really in some ways it's not sustainable. It's not the political coalition. I think the idea back in the 70s of the whole people of color thing was, well, black people are only 13 or so % of the electorate. We need allies. to help to jump on to be on the bandwagon with us, who may also suffer discrimination, to help support us. But now it's getting to the point where, well, now African Americans maybe 14%, but Asians and self-identified Native Americans and self-identified Hispanics are around 30%. So they're more than double. So it turns out that, you could say that, hey, we did all the heavy lifting here with the civil rights movement, and we're not now getting the benefits that we thought we were getting. So that tension is going to, I think, increase. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be kind of interesting. I mean, my preference would be not that it becomes a struggle of all against all and all the different groups start fighting with each other, but everyone sort of agrees like, hey, we should be looking for a common American identity. And as I say in the book, if we, in Classified, if we do feel that this American descendants of slaves or people who've been forced onto reservations deserve some sort of special treatment by the government to try to right past wrongs, we should do that on a non-racial basis. In other words, the fact that an American descendant of slaves is not the same as someone who father was the ambassador to Kenya, decided to stay in the United States after high school, and then is applying to Harvard. Right, that these are different categories, and a racial classification would include them both. A political classification of descendants of slaves would not. Same thing with Native Americans. There are some federal programs for Native Americans use blood quantum, that you have to be at least a quarter Native American by blood, and they'll actually, amazingly enough, horrifically enough, issue a certificate of blood quantum, which I had no idea about before I wrote Classified. And some use tribal membership. Both of those are kind of racial classifications, right? Especially like tribal membership. You may be a member of the Cherokee tribe because in 1830, your great-great-great-great-grandfather was a member and you inherited it, but no one's been affiliated in any meaningful way with the Cherokee for 180 years, except that you have this sort of racial heritage in part. So if we say, hey, people who live on Native American reservations, that's a political category. Those are the Indians who suffered the most from state oppression. They were not able to assimilate. They were not able to join mainstream American society. And it's not a racial category. It doesn't include everybody who could claim 1/4 Indian ancestry or Indian tribal membership based on race. It just includes people who have certain political relationship to the U.S. government.
So when it comes to, I'm on your point about the base, like the racial coalition for political ends. One of your papers you mentioned the term AAPI, which is like the new term Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and it used to be just Asian Americans, and now they're clumping together Pacific Islanders for exactly the purpose you just outlined, which is to have a bigger electoral force when it comes to like the political stuff. So I was wondering, I guess, almost like near the final question is, do you think that this is sort of just a phase based on because you mentioned how things are changing, the political winds are drifting, different ethnic groups are voting in different ways. I believe in the 2020 election, I think it was only white men who voted more Democrat than all other groups shifted more percentage towards the Republican side. So do you think this is just when it comes to working towards a common American identity, or at least just getting rid of all these unproductive terms? Do you think it'll come with time? Do you think there needs to be more heavy lifting? Do you think it's just sort of a phase of one particular political moment? I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
Sure. I can't resist commenting on the AAPI thing because it's ironic that activist groups are now calling themselves that, because in the official government statistics, and when you fill out college applications and whatnot, it used to be the original category was Asians and Pacific Islanders, which would include Native Hawaiians. And then what happened was in the 80s and 90s, people in Hawaii, which has both a large Native Hawaiian population and a large population of Samoans and other Pacific Islanders, they found they were applying to colleges in California. And when they applied to college in California, the colleges were discriminating against them. They say, because they're in the Asian category, we have this soft quota on Asians, so we're not going to. So not only are you not being benefited from being a member of a minority group, you're being harmed. So Hawaiians lobbied to have the group included with Native Americans. Native Americans didn't want them because they didn't want the resources they get from the Bureau of Indian Affairs being shared with Native Hawaiians. So a compromise was reached in which the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander group was split off from the Asian American group so they could have their own affirmative action category. So it's kind of ironic that now AAPI has become a thing because politically speaking, in other contexts, the Pacific Islanders wanted to separate. In any event, as far as the broader question, I'm a law professor rather than an anthropologist or sociologist. So I'm, asking me to predict the future on this. It would be even hard for them, but is even worse for me. But I will tell you what the sociologists say. There are some sociologists who think that we are gradually moving towards this common American multi-ethnic identity. That being an American won't be associated with race anymore. It'll be associated with being a sort of a mix, the way that you wouldn't necessarily associate Mexican with race or Brazilian with a specific race. Although maybe in those countries people do, I don't know. But at least as an American, I think of Mexico as just being a multiracial society. There's another group that think that the centrifugal forces are sufficient that will probably have something resembling the current classifications, although they're subject to shifting. Like I think it's hard to imagine as the South Asian population grows that they're not going to somehow split off from the East Asian. There's also a movement in the government to make MENA, Middle East and North Africa, a separate category, which would be an extra division in society. So there's some forces that way. And the third possibility is, and I think the most unhappy one, perhaps in a way, are those who think that all other racial and ethnic differences in the U.S. are mutable, but the black-white thing is never going to change. And the ultimate division will be between all other Americans and black Americans, and maybe some especially dark-skinned members of the other minority groups will associate themselves and be more associated with blacks. I can't tell you which of those, or maybe there are other options that we haven't even imagined. I'm really hoping for the first one. And, the book calls for the separation of race and state. And I use that phrase advisedly because I think we want the separation of race and state for the same reason as the separation of church and state, that people feel very strongly about ethnic and racial heritage, just like they feel strongly about religion. Dividing society in that way causes tensions and potentially even civil wars in ways that other kinds of classifications don't. Religious classifications do this, and racial ones do it as well. It's morally questionable to have the government favor one race or another in any context, as it is with religion. And it turns out that you could have pluralism much more easily, where everyone's accepting of each other, and we sort of have a common American creed because of not the full separation of church and say that's a myth, but because of the basic idea the government doesn't intervene much in religious matters. Eisenhower said something famous along those lines: "I don't care what religion someone is, as long as he believes in the basic American creed," or something like that, which of course means it's not all religions. But anyway, I'm hopeful, and I do think that but there are contrary forces. The one thing I think that is most disturbing to me now is this movement within the medical profession, urged on in some ways by local governments, state governments, and sometimes by the federal government, to divvy up medical care based on race. And prefer people of supposedly historically oppressed groups, regardless of their individual circumstances, for medical treatment. And that's the kind of thing that, college admissions causes some tension. But you know what? If you don't get into Harvard, you get into Tufts, or whatever, your life will be more or less the same ultimately. But grannies in the hospital, and some bureaucrat says, well, we have this, ethnic checklist, and you only get 3 points, and someone else's grandma is of a preferred racial group, and even though they're a little bit less sick than your grandma, they get 7, so they go first, and your granny dies, and and she could have been saved if they, that's the kind of thing that it strikes me as leading to all sorts of horrific potential consequences, not just in the sense that deciding on medical care based on race itself is horrific, but in the sense that I can't imagine anything that would be better designed to cause friction, tension, potentially violence.
And I think you're referring to, I think the CDC someone at the CDC released a presentation essentially calling for the divvying up of vaccines based on race rather than age, right? Because we've identified that, of course, older people die at higher rates. That's why older people should get the vaccine first. And I believe there was a whole controversy at the CDC because someone made a presentation about we should actually do it based on race and not on age. And that obviously, the justification might be that, that old white people don't have it as bad as young black people, and therefore that's the whole Pandora's box that they're opening up. And now it sounded very similar to what you said. I want to end by asking, I guess, a legal question, something you might be able to answer more fully, is that when it comes to going forward, we still live in a country with plenty of discrimination, plenty of inequity, plenty of disparities and whatnot. And the one side wants to essentially, they would listen to what you just said. It's like, okay, it's very complicated. Therefore, we just need to beef up the Leviathan, right? Just to get more racial studies doctorates into the government, just empower the state more so we can figure it out even better. What is your ideal legal framework or enforcement regime when it comes to, I guess, policing or educating disputes in a country as diverse as America?
Well, again, I think we can look at the religious context. No, the government is not allowed to favor any particular religion. It's allowed to recognize the existence of religion and take into account the existence and prohibit discrimination based on religion. But it doesn't play favorites. It doesn't say, the Mormons were driven out of Kansas in 1850 and therefore they get medical treatment first, or the Jehovah's Witnesses were suppressed in the 30s and 40s, and therefore Jehovah's Witnesses should be classified as differently than other Americans and be given different benefits. And I think we could do the same with race. The history of government and race, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, isn't a happy one. We should not be Panglossian or even or even optimistic about the government's capacity to wisely deal with race. And we should really stop talking about the government, right? Because that implies there's some singular entity that we could reason with, that could come with. We have to think politicians and bureaucrats. The question is, do you trust politicians and bureaucrats to decide who is of what race, how we define it, what the classification should be, and then what benefits you get or don't get based on those classifications? Again, things like enforcing civil rights laws, okay, but once you get beyond that and make classification a significant part of American life officially, you're asking for trouble. And I mean, the only good news is that I think with things like medicine, the one thing I could say about medicine is that if you actually told people that hey, blacks, then Hispanics, then Asians, whatever, a lot of people are going to suddenly discover a real or a fake ancestor of one of those ethnicities, right? No, people don't really want to lie in college admissions. They do sometimes, but not nearly as prevalent. But I think once life and death situations, because even though there are official definitions, because in practice they are self-identification is the norm. Self-identification of if you actually got to the point where you're divvying up medical care for sick people based on self-identified race, maybe that would help cause the whole deck of cards, the whole wall of cards to collapse. Because I can't, honestly, if I were in a life-threatening situation and I knew that that someone else might get ahead of me because they checked off some other box on their admission form at the emergency room, I'm checking the same box.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, and I hope more Americans will definitely listen to your insight and your input, and certainly I hope your book has many great sales as well.
All right, thanks so much.
Professor David Bernstein is a law professor at George Mason University, Antonin Scalia School of Law, and he's the author of the forthcoming book, Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. If you like what you heard today and you want to support more of AIER's content, make sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as well as check out our various podcasts on Spotify. If you really like what you heard and you want to support more cutting-edge research and outreach like this, make sure to become a donor. All that information and more can be found at AIER.org. Thank you.